Well, good afternoon, everybody. Nice to be with you. This is the third Zoom talk I've given, and I've got about 5 more booked before Christmas for the more adventurous Probus clubs. Some, though, have put it in the too difficult tray, but it seems to work. So we'll make a start. Normally, if we were all together at one of your meetings, I would now ask for a show of hands as to who has read Lady Chatterley's Lover. Now, I've given this talk, I would think, about 50 times, and the average number of hands that go up is always, give or take, 50% of the audience. Every other person has read this book. I then ask, how many of you, when you were much younger, read it under the covers at night with a torch? And again, a flurry of hands go up. So it's quite interesting, and it sets the talk off on a good keel. So let's deal first with D.H. Lawrence. D.H. Lawrence, he was born into Eastwood. Now, Eastwood was a mining village on the outskirts of Nottingham. And this was his home, where he lived with his mum and his dad. And today, if you actually visit this location, you'll find this. His house is to the left. You can just see the black front door, but they've made a shop stroke shrine to him on the actual street corner. His parents were a strange bunch, because Dad was a barely literate miner, could hardly read or write, and yet his mother was a school teacher. Quite how they got together, I do not know, but there's no doubt about it that D.H. Lawrence didn't really like his father, but he loved his mother dearly and spent most of his time with her. He was, in fact, a sickly child. He wasn't of strong character physically at all, and as a result, mother did a lot of schooling with him. He eventually managed to get a place at Nottingham University, very much with his mother's guidance. And he then, hang on, that's it, good. He then he came out with a teaching certificate, and he got a position at a school. And this is ever so strange. There he is in Nottingham University, living on the outskirts of Nottingham, but he gets a position as a school teacher in Croydon. Quite how that has come about, I have no idea. I have been unable to find out. But anyway, he's there and he starts writing poetry, and some of it is published in a London pamphlet. And he realizes at this point that is what he wants to do with his life. At this time, he had a setback with his health. He was waiting for a railway station in the pouring rain, and he got a touch of pneumonia. And then from that time on, TB was something that really, really troubled him. In 1911, when he was still very, very young chap, he wrote The White Peacock. That was his first book, and he was 26. About this time, he meets this young lady. This is Frida, of German extraction, and they start going out together. They fall in love, and they elope, which is a bit tricky because she's married, and she's married to a professor at Nottingham University where he studied. But off they go. 1913, and he writes Sons and Lovers, which many of you, I think, will have read, and that is regarded in literary circles as his best work. At the outbreak of war in 1914, they get married. and D.H. Lawrence isn't fit and healthy enough to be of any use to anybody, sadly. So they make off and they go round the world traveling. And they finish up in Australia and eventually make their way. I've got something that's come up, which I can't read. Hang on, everybody.
No, Terry, if you just continue, I'm dealing with the entries.
Okay, well, I've got something at the top. Anyway, they make their way. Now, I can't go on to the next slide. I'm pressing away and it won't go. You are screen sharing. Let's press that, if I can. Yeah. We were going so well, weren't we?
Yeah.
What happened?
I am stuck on the slide. My technical expert is here.
You're in Australia.
Oh. Don't touch it. Your cursor's gone. Where's the cursor? Is it because somebody's done? Has somebody moved something on the other side?
I don't know.
The other end.
Ah, that's the next slide.
Right. So,
Let's hope we're back on track now.
All I did was click the mouse.
Okay. Right. So he now is in the United States and they settle in Taos in New Mexico. I always ask how many people have been to Taos. I put my hand up and I'm usually the only one. But it really is an atmospheric place in New Mexico, not far, obviously, from the Mexican border. Here, his wife later said that he was at his happiest. By 1928, they've moved to Florence. And 1928 is the year that he wrote Lady Chatterley's Lover. He wrote it, he read it through, and he wasn't happy, so he rewrote the whole thing. He read it through, he wasn't happy, so for the third time, he wrote it again. Then he was happy. Now he's got to find a publisher, and he knew this would be difficult because when his usual publisher looked at the work and said, on your bike, because I'm not publishing that. Look at the language, look at the content, no way. And he had a great deal of difficulty. But in the end, a small Italian publisher came forward and said, well, I don't want to go mass producing this because there's going to be trouble. Why don't we do a limited edition? And that's what happened. There it is. That's an original copy, 1,000 copies with a vellum cover with the sign of the phoenix, which was his emblem, which was put onto the front embossed. And then they were numbered, every copy, and D.H. Lawrence signed them all. Now, they decided they would sell them because these were going to be collector's items at £2 each, which today I've worked out is £115. Immediately, 140 of them were shipped to the USA, and many other people rushed to buy them as collector's items. Yeah. I discovered this check made out to D.H. Lawrence in August 1928 for £5 and 2 shillings. What I think happened, somebody bought 3 copies and got a discount. During his lifetime, only another 3,000 copies were produced by a French publisher. So in his whole lifetime, only 4,000 copies of this work were produced. but it did give him financial security, real security, for the first time in his life. His royalties from the book, I've worked out in modern day prices, was over £80,000. But his health is failing, and he finishes up in this hilltop town or village in Vern, which was in the south of France, looking down on Nice. And eventually his ailments got the better of him, and he died in 1930. He was 44 years of age. So, what was the law at the time on publishing obscene material? Well, in the early days, all obscene publications were dealt with by the church through the ecclesiastical courts. And it wasn't until this lot came along that things were to change. Wellington's army during the late 1700s up to the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, they rampaged across France, Spain, and into Portugal. And they picked up all sorts of bits and pieces on the way, including obscene prints and obscene poems and things that the locals sold them to get money. And they came back. And many of them now were homeless. They'd been away on those campaigns for years and years, in fact, into decades. And when they came back, they'd lost track of their family, whatever they had. They had no home. They had no skills other than soldiering. And as a result, in bands, they used to roam the countryside, thieving and finding any way possible to scrape a living and get some money. And this was causing an awful lot of problems to the authorities. So in 1824, they passed an act of Parliament, and it says it's to punish the idle and disorderly, rogues and vagabonds in that part of Great Britain called England. It was the Vagrancy Act, and it was a catch-all act. It just lists offence after offence after offence. I'll just tell you a few of them. Anyone going about with housebreaking implements, anyone loitering to commit a felony, begging, showing arms to gather money, indecent exposure, and showing, or publishing as we would call it today, an obscene print. So this is the first time, 1824, that there is a statute covering obscene material. And notices went up all around the hamlets telling them, notice to all vagabonds found lodging, loitering, begging within this hamlet will be taken up and dealt with as the law directs. They now had statute behind them. We get to 1839, I think it was, 1840s, 50s, we get Victoria on the throne. And it was a time of greater respectability. And of course, as we all know, respectability is only on the surface. There's all sorts of unpleasantness going on underneath, and no more so than in Wych Street. Now, I would normally ask you, does anyone know what that street is called today? Wych Street? And of course it is Aldwych. But it was the Soho of the 60s of its day, because there were only two kinds of properties in Wych Street. One, public houses. Two, bookshops. And the bookshops had all the naughty books under the counter. But there was nothing the police could do about it, because the law related to public places, and it didn't allow for them to go in and seize material from the back of the store or under the counter. So as a result, we have the Obscene Publications Act of 1857, which says, first chapter, it sets out what an obscene publication is, which you would obviously understand. Secondly, it gave police a power of arrest. And thirdly, they could apply to a magistrate to get a summons to enter premises and seize material. So we've now got search warrants to go in and sweep up all the nasty books from under the counter or at the back of the shop. And that is the way that law stayed. So here we are, look, this is 1922, James Joyce's Ulysses. It was banned because it had one C word in it. Forget the rest of the literature, it was banned and not allowed in this country. And if anyone had the audacity to bring it in, the customs officers, when searching, would seize it. And the same goes for The Well of Loneliness, which was written by Radcliffe Hall. Now, that was 1928, the same year as the publishment of Lady Chatterley, and it was a book on lesbianism. And it was banned based on one sentence and one sentence alone, which said, and that night they were not divided. Banned. So you can see how tight things were. On a lighter note, through the 40s and the 50s, Donald McGill produced so many seaside postcards. There's just one to remind you of what they were like. And no one ever did anything because most of them had double meanings, one that the children could chuckle over and one that the adults could chuckle over, same cartoon. Anyway, nothing was ever done. But then suddenly in 1954, they decide we really ought to prosecute this guy. And 34,000 of his postcards, mainly up from the pier and the prom, were seized. And the director of public prosecutions said he must be prosecuted. So there he is. He's now 80 years of age. They finally caught up with him. He's taken before Lincoln Magistrates Court, where he pleads guilty to publishing obscene material, and he is fined the equivalent today of £1,000 with £500 costs. That's at today's prices. But while all this is going on, the literary community were getting more and more upset with James Joyce's book, Radcliffe Hall's book, D.H. Lawrence's book, all being banned in this country. And they found somebody to speak for them, Roy Jenkins. 1951, he is petitioned by the Literary Society, please, can we have an up-to-date Obscene Publications Act? We are working on one from 1857. This is ridiculous. And he then drafts a private member's bill, and things move very slowly normally with private members' bills. And he started his campaign in about 1951, and it wasn't until 1959, after an enormous struggle, that we got the Obscene Publications Act, 1959. First three chapters exactly the same. Definition, arrest, search warrant. But they added a fourth for the first time. And it said a work will not be considered obscene if it is of particular scientific, artistic, literary benefit of the community or for the common good. And that was the turning point for the literary people. At this point, up pops a penguin. Sir Alan Lane, founder of Penguin Books paperbacks. Because what happened in 1934, he was on Exeter St. David's Station, having been to see Agatha Christie, and he realizes that his train journey back to London was going to be a long one because he had nothing to read. And he thought, wouldn't it be wonderful if we had slot machines on stations where people could put in a modest amount of money and open up and get a paperback book out. And that was the idea created on that railway station in 1934. And he set about it. And by 1935, he was launched. And it grew, and it grew, and it grew until they were doing extremely well. But now it's 1960, just after the Obscene Publications Act has been passed, and he would like to produce a paperback book of Lady Chatterley's Lover, to celebrate the 30th anniversary of D.H. Lawrence's death. And that's his plan. And he's setting it in motion. But the legal eagles get to hear about this, particularly in the DPP's office. And immediately they say, well, good Lord, we can't have this. That is an appalling book. How they knew it was, I've no idea, because you couldn't get it in this country. But obviously, they must have sneaked a copy in from time to time. So the DPP rings New Scotland Yard, and he gets through to the Obscene Publications Squad. And he talks to Detective Inspector Mahoney and says, look, he says, we don't want any trouble. Penguin Books, established, respectable firm. Here they're thinking of publishing the unabridged version of Lady Chatterley's. Could you pop along to their offices in High Holborn and just warn them off? Right, says Mahoney. So he goes along on a mission of putting oil on troubled waters, no intention of getting involved in criminal proceedings. He's just going to give them what we would used to call the gypsy's warning. Don't think about publishing it. And he sees Sir Alan Lane, and Sir Alan Lane says, he says, that's a bit difficult, he says. We've printed 200,000 copies already. Says Mahoney. So he scuttles back to the DPP's offices and explains. And in August 1960, it is agreed in all parties, that's the police, the DPP's office, and Penguin Books, who were cooperating magnificently, that it had to be a test case under the new Act of Parliament. So Mahoney goes along to the offices in High Holborn and he says, would you like to give me a copy of this book you have had printed? And they say, certainly, why don't you have 12? And Mahoney takes possession of 12 paperback copies of Lady Chatterley's Lover, unabridged. And at that point, Penguin Books have published. So Mahoney takes a couple of copies along to Bow Street Magistrates Court and says, have a look at this. We'd like to apply for a summons under the new Act. So the magistrate says, come back in a couple of days. So no doubt he went home and put his feet up in the evening and read the book, or maybe just those sections that he thought was appropriate to read. And as a result, he issued a summons against Penguin Books under the new Obscene Publications Act. and they appear before Bow Street's Magistrates Court. There we have it, now defunct, of course, which is a great shame. It was a real landmark. And they appear, and they plead not guilty, and everyone agrees it should go for trial. And for trial, from Bow Street, it's the Old Bailey. So we've now got Penguin Books, a respectable publisher, going for trial at the Old Bailey. But now there's a problem, because the DPP's worked out, well, we've got 12 copies. Bow Street have got a couple. The police have kept a couple. We'll have to give Treasury Counsel, who's going to prosecute one, and his junior will have to have one, and the solicitor will have to have one. And then, of course, the judge will have to have one. We haven't got any for the jury. Now, that's embarrassing. They can hardly go back to Penguin Books now and say, oh, thank you for those 12 copies. Can we have another 12, please? When you are actually summoning them to go to the Old Bailey for publishing obscene material. So a message, a frantic message went out via Interpol all around Europe. Can anybody come up with 12 unabridged copies of Lady Chatterley's Lover? And of course it was the Swiss who said, we can, always an eye for business. They said, we can send you them. And they did, with a bill. And the police looked at the bill and said, this isn't fair. It's the DPP's case. They passed the bill over to him, and reluctantly he paid for the books. So in October 1960, we get to the Old Bailey with this case. Now, up till now, there has only been one prosecution under the Act, and that was R.V. Shaw. Mr. Shaw had published a directory of prostitutes. Now, I would have thought that was quite a handy book, but it didn't go down well with the authorities. He was prosecuted, found guilty, and sent to prison for 9 months. Whether any of you have still got that directory, I do not know. So we're at the Central Criminal Court, nicknamed the Old Bailey. There it is in all its glory. Now, I don't know whether any of you have been inside the Old Bailey. I'm not suggesting other than a witness, but you can queue, as many did to hear this trial, to get in the public gallery. Or if you are involved in the case in any way, you will go into this magnificent building. It is incredibly impressive. Have a look at that. This is the main gathering point outside all the courts. And it seems to me the architecture is such that it is there to put the fear of God into the offenders, because it all looks so incredibly impressive. They put it in court number 1. Now, number 1 court is for murderers. It's for people who commit treason, armed robbers, serial rapists. And all we've got in the box now is a penguin, just for what would normally be dealt with at magistrates' court, publishing obscene material. There we are, number 1 court at the Old Bailey. So let the trial begin. The jury is ushered in, 12 of them, 9 men and 3 ladies. All the legal eagles are lined up. Lots of fees to be made here, I can tell you. And for the defence, it's Gerald Gardner, QC, an impeccable CV. He went to Harrow School, Magdalen College, Oxford, into the Coldstream Guards, came out, became a barrister, eventually a QC, highly respected, and a few years later, under Wilson's government, he was given a government appointment. And purely as an aside, what a lucky man he was, because in 1982, he was on government business in Northern Ireland at the height of the Troubles. He was at some meeting, his car was outside, and the IRA taped a bomb under his car. He came out, he got on, the chauffeur drove off, and the bomb dropped off. What a lucky man he was. Prosecuting is Treasury Counsel, Mervyn Griffith-Jones. Now, people who knew him said he is trapped in the 18th century because he wasn't a man of his time at all. He was decades and decades back. And he opened the case, waving the book in the air and telling the jury it's the filthiest book ever published. And he listed all the words that were in there, which we shouldn't mention. He said, there are over 30 F or effing words. There are 14 C words. And he went right through the card with everything you can think of. When I was at the National Archives researching this and got the crime file out, I found a piece of plain white A4 attached, and all the rude words were written over the top, and in different coloured inks in columns was the page number and the paragraph number where they appeared. So obviously some clerk had been assigned this job of totting up all the obscenities. So he says, I know this is obscene, and you two members of the jury will also know once you've had a good look at it. And he said, let me tell you something, he said. And what he said to them was this: members of the jury, is this a book you would want your wife or servants to read? If you were a member of that jury, what would you have thought? I said he was trapped in time. He hadn't got a clue about the man on the Clapham omnibus. The judge says, well, you have opened your case. I think this is a good time for the jury to retire and read the book. So the 12 copies from the Swiss were hastily produced, and in the jury room they went. Now, just as a convoy can move only as fast as the slowest ship, so a jury can only read as fast as the slowest reader. And although they were only allowed to read it in the jury room during the 10 a.m. till 4 a.m. slot, it took the slowest reader 5 days to read the book. So the ones who were fast readers, they must have sat there twiddling their thumbs for hours. But eventually they reported back to Judge Byrne that they were ready to continue. Splendid. So they came back, and Griffith-Jones produces Detective Inspector Mahoney, who proves to the jury that the books were published. He attended their headquarters and was given 12 books. He proves they're published. Now, as far as Mervyn Griffith-Jones was concerned, I have proved my offence. A, they were published. B, they are horrendously obscene. Fine. This cartoon appeared while the jury were out reading it for 5 days. It's a lovely cartoon, and it has implications for what happened later. I found this in the paper within the last year. Fight for Lady Chatterley's Dirty Bits. The judge's copy was up for auction, and in it were lots and lots of notes written by the judge's wife, directing him to all the naughty bits, because a judge is an incredibly busy man and did not have time to read the book. So he gave it to his wife, and she marked his cards as to where all the dreadful bits were, and it went up for auction. So the legal wrangle begins. First witness for the defence is Richard Hoggard. Now, he is highly respected in literary circles. He's a senior lecturer at Leicester University, specialising in English. And he said to the jury, yes, when I first read it, it shocked me. But as I read on, the words became sanitized. Because if you think about it, we don't have a word that really describes it. And the F word is universal. And the more I read, the more I was comfortable with it. He said, this is a great work of literature and it should not be banned. Well, Merlin Griffiths-Jones was on his feet in no time. And he tore into Mr. Hoggard. And Mr. Hoggard stood his ground, kept a straight bat, and wouldn't be shaken by Merlin Griffiths-Jones. Thank you. Call the next witness. Well, here's four of them. Let's start at the top. The Bishop of Woolwich. He came in and said, this is a book that all my parishioners should read. Well, Mervyn Griffiths-Jones very nearly went into a state of collapse. Questioned, but he said no. He said, this is a wonderful work of literature and it tells about love and the physical act. All my parishioners, in fact, all Christians should read it. Dame Rebecca West followed. Sir Stanley Unwin followed. St. John Stevens followed. Roy Jenkins followed. And there was an army of literary people getting in the witness box defending Penguin books. Initially, Mervyn Griffiths-Jones, he tore into them. But it was rather like a tidal wave over 3 days that absolutely finally engulfed him. And towards the end of 30-odd witnesses, he was hardly saying anything. He'd pop up and say no questions. 3 days, 35 defence witnesses. Now, Judge Byrne is starting to get a little bit fidgety. And he says to the defence counsel, do you have any more witnesses? And defence counsel, Gerald Gardner, said, yes, my lord, I have another 36 waiting outside. I don't think we need to hear them, said Judge Byrne, as your lordship pleases. And they were people like these people. Iris Murdoch, Aldous Huxley, etc., etc., never got called. And all these witnesses, not one of them claimed expenses. They all felt so strongly about this case. So we come to the judge's summing up. The press who gave articles and features afterwards, so he really sided on the prosecution side. Because as far as he was concerned, whatever you say, it's really, really obscene. But of course, his problem was under the section 4 of the new act, if it is of particular literary merit, it shall not be considered an offence under the act. So now it was up to the jury. And out they went. They went out at 12 noon and they were gone for 3 hours. Now, being a cynic, I reckon they thought, well, at least we can get one more free lunch out of this. And they probably stretched it out and had a nice lunch, etc., and then came back and delivered their verdict, which was a resounding not guilty. In fact, when they were questioned outside, 9 of the 12 had virtually made their minds up beforehand and said this should never have even been bought. So there is a cheer from the public gallery, which the judge did nothing to quieten. And then Gerald Gardner gets up and he said, my lord, there is a question of expenses and fees, he said. How much are you asking for? And he said, I'm asking for £13,000. Now, in today's money, that is about £225,000. As I said earlier, the legal profession know how to rack things up. The judge thought for a moment. Suddenly he stood. He pushed his chair back, saying nothing at this point. He walked out and he looked over his shoulder at Gerald Gardner and said, I make no order as to costs. Because that wily judge knew Penguin Books had just had a week-long full national publicity, and they would sell a whole host of these books and make a fortune. No order as to costs. Hooray, as Lady Chatterley is cleared. Bless the jury. The innocence of Lady Chatterley. Now we can go ahead, says the Penguin chief. And you can get a good Easter egg for 12 and 6. This man was now branded Mervyn Griffiths-Jones. He was laughing all the way to the bank. The 200,000 copies went nowhere. They had to get printers hastily doing reprints, and they even had to bring some in from Holland. London bookshops decided they'd take the books out onto the pavement because there would be such a crush, and they didn't want a whole herd of people knocking everything over in their store or nicking other books and putting them under their coats. So the sales took place on the pavement. Foyles had 300 copies and sold out in 15 minutes. There we are, look. Lady Chatterley's Lover became an instant bestseller. You too right it did. Selfridges, they only had 250 copies. And they said, we have taken orders for over 1,000 copies. And then, of course, the press did little tableaus, arranging people to make it look as though it was authentic. It wasn't, of course. There we are. This is what was being published at the time. Those sales fell when people found out that it wasn't that smutty stuff they'd hoped for. It goes on a bit. It's all arty, boring. What's all the fuss about? Too many bleeding grouse, too much weather, etc., etc. But nevertheless, in the first year, they sold 2 million copies, outselling the Bible. Sunday Pictorial, they decided to serialize it. It was a watershed. Penguin Books, being told they weren't guilty, was, if you like, opening the floodgates to new legislation during the 1960s. So many of our Acts of Parliament needed modernising. And the first one followed the next year, the Suicide Act of 1961. Up till then, it was a criminal offence to commit suicide and a criminal offence to aid and abet. What they did was to decriminalise anybody who did commit suicide, although it still remained an offence to aid and abet. The abolition of the death penalty followed a few years later. The Abortion Act of 1967, brought in by David Steele, whereby prior to that it was a criminal offence for a woman to have an abortion, but under this new legislation, provided two doctors agreed that it was for the benefit of her health of the child or whatever, it would no longer be a crime. All being brought up to date. Sexual Offences Act of the same year. Homosexuality in all its forms was a criminal offence up to 1967, but this act said that two people over 21 consenting in private, it will no longer be a criminal offence. We were moving on. The Theatres Act, they abolished censorship in 1968. And in 1969, the Divorce Reform Bill, which made divorces and court proceedings far more simple, with the breakdown of marriage to be the sole grounds for divorce. So there we are. 1960, with the vanguard of Penguin Books in 1960, brought about a huge change to our legislation throughout the 60s, modernising Acts of Parliament. The 60s weren't necessarily all good. Free love was freely available. The pill came in, which led to greater promiscuity. I love this one. Mini skirts shortened. Ideal for a tailor shop. And of course, it heralded drug abuse with all the complications that it entailed. So the 1960s really was a mixed bag. Penguin now has passed its 80th birthday and going strong. And I'll leave you with some words of D.H. Lawrence, which I think are quite apt for that book. A woman to have lived her life, you can't quite see it, but basically he said if she doesn't live her life, she will live to repent it for not having lived it. And how true is that? Gentlemen, thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed the talk.